says stop
Should be
video, so
good.
that means,
Okay,
okay,
that's
all
recording.
right. So what you see here is very interesting. This is a mass grave that was unearthed in an alternative location called Lachish. And here you can see how, compared to the individual burials, you can see that this is a Canaanite mass burial pit. So what happens was, whoever these people were living in Ashkelon along um, the um, the the coastal plain along the coast of Israel, they were not Canaanites. They were, whoever these Philistina were, whoever these Phoenicians were, they were not like everyone else, Canaanite, Girgashite, Jebusite, Hittite. They were nothing like them culturally. Here you see on the bottom right an alternative grave where they are laying flat and face up. And you can actually look at this person, their arms are crossed. Now, regardless, I wanted to show you again that this is the Philistine map where they were in the time of King David. And everyone knows that during King David's reign, actually, when he was already a teenager, the number one enemy of the children of Israel during that time, King Saul, King David, and even until the beginning of King Solomon's reign, our enemies were the Philistines. And up here, right at the top of the map, would be Ashkelon. The capital of the Philistines was Gat, and that's where our tradition is, where Goliath came from. But here you can see Ashdod. I'm sorry, this is Ashkelon, that's Ashdod. So the map is further south and I wasn't paying attention, I apologize. But you can definitely see that this is definitively the Philistine coastal plain. And they were a thorn in our side, literally, for over 250 years, from the time of Samson till the time of Solomon. And you can see where it really overlaps the area that we now know as Gaza. This is a Phoenician warrior that is consistent with, if you look, this is a bronze spearhead. They have and we're going to see it, but this is a rendering, an artistic rendering of many of the hieroglyphics that you can see here in this slide. And if you look closely, you see the headgear that this Phoenician is wearing and the headgear here. Here you can see metal as compared to alternative spears, Iron Age. And again, you can see that this overlapping blue area was the area of the Philistines. Why is this all important? This is all important is because the name Palestine and the Palestinians comes from the concept of Philistina, where the Philistines lived. And here you can see in this wall carving that you can see that they are a different people than the indigenous Hittites, Jebusites, Girgashites, etc., the 7 Canaanite groups. And in this, one of the most famous stories from the book of Judges, and I believe you studied this with Ahuva, was the story of Samson. We also studied it, where Samson took the jaw of a donkey and he killed 1,000 Philistines. So the idea is that, again, you see that from the time of Samson all the way up until the beginning of King Solomon's reign, for approximately 250-year period, these people were our severe enemies. And at one point, to show his great statue, Samson killed 1,000 of them with a jawbone of a donkey. It's from the Bible, the book of Judges. So here, I found this actually on a website. The Getty Museum had a really interesting ancient Levant study and artwork. So here, the reason why this is very important is that you can definitively see that the Philistines are not native to ancient Israel. And if you look closely, on the left, this is the average Canaanite. They wore leather hats, they used axes, very rudimentary weapons, and even their shield was just deep wood or hardwoods, as compared to the Philistines, where you can see they actually had metal implements in the Bronze Age. It was really important that you saw distinctively they had certain crafts that the locals did not have. They did not have the ability to smelt metals. They didn't have the ore. They didn't have the heat source to melt it. It was a science that the ancient Canaanites did not have, but the Philistines did. And that's why when you talk about the weapons, for example, even the weaponry that King David used rocks and a slingshot, where the Philistines had specific lances and charabim, which are the average swords that we know of. And again, here is a hieroglyphic, not a hieroglyphic, but a pictorial representation of the difference between what we saw before as the Canaanites as compared to the Philistines. And the Philistines were definitively a, um, a different group. And this is, I just took from the book of Judges specifically, the 5 lords of the Philistines and all of the Canaanites and the Sidonians and the Hivites that dwelt in the Mount Har Lebanon, from Mount Belar Hamon until the entering of Hamat. Rabbi, why are you quoting this? And the answer is that there were 5 towns that had the equivalent, like town kings, what we would call, a strong mayor, a clan leader, but they were separate from the Canaanites. So when we hear arguments that the modern day Palestinians are descendants of the Philistines, and that's where the origin of their name is, that you see that historically it's just that they were a separate group. So if they were so separate, here's the other thing that will actually come at the very end of this, from the book of Judges. And his father and mother said unto him, this is Samson, never a woman among the daughters of your own brothers or among my own people, that you go out to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines. So the idea is that they were culturally an anomaly. They were nothing to do with they were not part of us, and they were not our co-religionists, and they were definitively a group not specific to the area. The ancient Philistia directly overlays the Gazan territory. Therefore, Palestinians are indigenous to the land. And this is the famous discussion. And in fact, that's where they get their name from. Palestinians and Palestine comes from this Phoenician tribal group that were known as the Philistines. And again, it started from the late Bronze era, early Iron period. So you see again that remarkably, the area, the Phoenician communities of the Levant, they lived in what we would call Philistina, and that's why they were called Palestinians. So the question is, are Palestinians today the Philistines of ancient times? And again, this is from I believe I got it again from the Getty Museum. And again, you can see specifically the bronze swords, the bronze shields, the very specific headgear. That was nothing like any of the other indigenous people.
Rabbi,
yes.
Until 1948, we were called the Palestinians also.
Right.
And basically, and Jerusalem Post was called the Palestine Post.
That's absolutely correct. Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. Absolutely, 1,000%, and very, very applicable. More so, in fact, is that calling the area Palestine is really, it was a territory, the way that we would say the Everglades. It was not a country. It was just a territory. This is the Roman Empire at its height. And you can see, even in Britannia, if you remember, we discussed Hadrian's Wall. Actually, I discussed it on the High Holidays. This over here was Hadrian's Wall, the same guy who would destroy the Bar Kokhba revolution. So the idea is from Britain all the way to Iran, what is today Iraq. And what happens is, you can see there's no place here called Palestine. And this is, if you opened up a history book of the Roman Empire, these are the names that they were called, the areas that they were called. And they were more territories, and they were not city-states, because it was the Roman Empire and there were no subsidiaries. But when you look closely here, what do you see here? Judea, written using the Latin the Latin alphabet, because we're going to learn it also at the very end of this class tonight. There's no J in the Latin alphabet. So they use the letter I, and that's as close as you can get to saying the word Judea. Okay, so prior to the edicts that would be known as the Hadrian persecutions, the Romans referred to ancient Israel as Judea. And that's what this is here. Again, you can see it right there and here in a close-up. There is no letter for J in the Latin alphabet, and so it was written with an I. Again, during Roman times, there were no Palestinians. And the reason is because the Palestinians were way gone by the time the Greeks got there in 330 BCE. When Alexander the Great conquered Judea, there already were no Philistines left. And that's why even the Greeks did not call the area Philistina or Palestine. Now, 135, the temple had already been destroyed in the year 70. And this is a bust of the famous Emperor Hadrian. And what happened was, this is the ancient Temple Mount where our Holy Temple was built. And you can see this is known as the Kidron Valley. This is the David's city that they raised. This is actually Mount Zion. And this is where he built a temple to Jupiter. This is again in the year 70. You can see I like the picture because it accurately portrays the destruction of the temple and its burning. And again, this became a Roman higher city, and this is the city of David that also had been destroyed in the year 70. Again, just so you can get an idea, this is the Temple Mount in the year 70, and you can see it's burning. And this is where the Kotel is. And here is known as the Southern Wall Plaza, where they perform conservative and reform bar and bat mitzvahs. So again, this is post-destruction. And this is what Emperor Hadrian rebuilt Jerusalem. And did I say Jupiter? I think I said Jupiter. He created a temple to Jupiter. And again, this right here, where I'm moving the cursor here, this is the Mount of Olives. This is the Kidron Valley. This is the where the temple stood. And over here, from here to here, if you walk along this walkway and then make a right-hand turn, that's where the Kotel is. And if you look closely over here, you'll see these arches. When you go into the rabbinic tunnels, so you get an idea of what's going on. And why does this have to do with Philistines? You'll see in just a moment. So what happened was Hadrian, when the Bar Kokhba revolution, was so successful that for about 3.5, 4 years, we embarrassed the Romans. So when he came and destroyed Bar Kokhba, the revolution at Beitar, in addition to destroying everything having to do with Judaism, he also renamed the area Syria Palestina. Assyria is over here. And he picked a name. Who are our greatest enemies? The Philistines. So Hadrian picked a name that would be most insulting to the memory of the Jews. So from Syria Palestina, it became Palestina. Now, it was a Roman invention, and that was the extent of the origin of the name Palestine for anything in the Levant. And the Levant refers to what we would call the Near East. Let's say Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Syria, and Lower Turkey would be called the Levant. Lebanon and Lower Turkey would be called the Levant. Some people include Iraq. I don't think it's really included, though, politically. So the question is, look at this map. And we all know colonialism, the practice of gaining political control over other countries and supplanting the indigenous culture, language, and religion with their own. So this is, so this dark red is where Islam started. Here you can see Mecca. This is Medina. Down here is Sana'a, which is now in Yemen. So you can see this was the empire under Muhammad. And then immediately afterwards, the Rashidun Caliphate extended it to Iran, Iraq, into southern Turkey, and Eastern Africa. This is Egypt, this is Tunisia, and parts of Libya. Okay, and then the third extension up until the year 70 was the Umayyad Caliphate. And you can see that they expanded all the way into Spain and to the westernmost tips of North Africa, which is Morocco, Tunisia, and the rest of Libya. In addition to that, well into Afghanistan. See, this is Kabul. Kabul is in Afghanistan. Now, none of these countries were Muslim by definition. It was a new religion. It was less than 100 years old. They were not Muslim. They did not speak Arabic. They did not, they were a completely different religion, different culture, different people, different ethnicity. Now, what's colonialism? The practice of gaining political control over other countries and supplanting the indigenous culture, language, and religion with their own. So let me ask you a question. Who are the real colonialists? I mean, it's a no-brainer. They accuse us of being colonialists. It's unbelievable. Let's continue. This is the areas at one time under Muslim rule. The only problem is that if you remove Spain and certain parts of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, etc., and most of India. By the way, India is only 13% Muslim only. Why? Because in 1948, they forcibly transmigrated over 15 million Palestinians to East and West Pakistan, which now it's only Pakistan and Bangladesh. But you can see that this is colonialism. They accuse us of colonialism. You know, European colonialism was nothing. European colonialism, they were amateurs compared to this. Here, again, who are the real colonialists? This is modern day, is the modern day Islamic world. So if you look closely, there are actually, I didn't learn this until a couple of days ago, there are actually like 4 schools of legal Islam. I only thought Sunni and Shia. And turns out that there's these different schools called Hanafi, Shafi, Hanabalis, and Maliki. And I think it's like nuances of how they practice Sunni and Shia. I think it's like saying Hasidism and Yeshiva and Litvish. But regardless, this is the colonial influence of Islam and the Arab civilization. And now here's one of the most famous proofs that the current Palestinians are not descendants of the Palestinians of ancient time. There's no letter P in Arabic. This is the Arabic alphabet. I'm not sure if I ever told you this, but my son Yonatan majored in psychology undergraduate and Arabic. He reads, writes, and speaks a very decent Arabic. And there's no letter P in Arabic. They pronounced their homeland Palestine with a B because they don't have the capacity to, it takes years and years of them practicing to come out with the letter P. So it's hard to comprehend a people naming their country with a letter of which they can't even pronounce or spell. They don't have a letter P in Arabic. How do they spell Palestine? So again, this is just proofs that they're not the indigenous people. They can't even pronounce the country they claim to be the originators of. So getting back to some archaeology and proof that they are not the original descendants of indigenous people of ancient Israel. What you see on the left is a Mycenaean pottery stirrup vessel of squat broad form with concentric rings and geometric designs in brown slip. And where is it from? It is from Europe. It's now the same exact period from, it's a Philistine biochromatic, it's 2 colors, pottery vessel, and it is remarkably similar in technique, in size, and in coloring mechanisms. So coloring clay, and patterns were remarkably, and all the rest of the pottery in this display show that the pottery of the ancient Palestinians was more Greek and European. Actually, it's Aegean. The Aegean communities of the Aegean Sea basin. You see that remarkable similarities in their pottery. And pottery is not just functional utilitarian, it's also an art form. So you see that culturally, artistically, whoever the Palestinians were, they were not indigenous to the Levant, but they came from an area near the Aegeans, and we're going to see that map in just a moment. These are pottery shards originating in the Aegean coastal regions. This is on the left. On the right, this is Philistine monochromatic pottery from Gat, which was the capital, in Ashdod. And again, you can see that the purpose of that article was to show that there are amazing similarities in, so for example, if you look at this piece of pottery on the bottom right and this piece of pottery on the left, you'll see that the symbols and the artwork is remarkably similar in their texturing. If you look particularly again at their methodology of making their pottery handles, and these are things that were different than the rest of the Canaanite communities.
Can I say
Yes,
something?
please, always, always. I encourage everyone to make a comment.
Just the in 1948, there were only about 250,000 Arabs in Gaza. Also before 1948, most of the most of the Arabs that are now in the Judean Samaria were not there. They came there to help for economic reasons.
So one of the most famous proofs, and I was trying to find time to do it tonight, was approximately in 1875, I think it was, Mark Twain,
Yep.
Samuel Clemens visited ancient Israel, visited Israel, Palestine. It wasn't even called Palestine, he called it Judea. And he talks that, like he traveled for days and didn't see any Arabs. He saw Arabs in Beersheba, and he saw them in the mixed community of Jaffa. And the whole point was that there were that he read. And then why do you think he wrote the famous paragraph saying how great the Jews were? Because after being in Israel in the 1870s, he saw the difference between what the Arabs were doing and what the Jews were doing. And
By
that's
the
why,
way, the book is called Innocence Abroad, and you can get it
right.
in the library. I'm reading it now.
So the whole point is that that's again historic. He didn't have a dog in that fight. There was no fight in the 1870s. There was no reason for him to make, a political statement. It wasn't a political statement. It was an observation. And again, these are things that we can use when people are make inflammatory comments saying that the Palestinians are the indigenous people to Israel and that we are the colonialists. So I just placed this very famous rendering of what a Phoenician warrior looks like. And this here is the Aegean Basin. It's Greece, it's Albania, it's Croatia, etc., and the Italy. And that's where these people were indigenous from, because same pottery, same burial rites, same techniques of creating metals, and they were definitely. So when they tell us that they're the true descendants of Palestine, Palestinians are the true descendants, Philistines, said, okay, great. Then you're from the Aegean basin. You're not from the Levant. Now there's even more. So this is that picture. I don't know why I did this, but this is where in Ashkelon in 2013 at the dig. But what they did find is, now we get to the science of this evening. So they were able to identify DNA from those skeletons.
So I'm just a little confused. I really appreciated your comment about colonialism and the expansion of the original Muslim empire. My question is, are you telling us that that the Palestinians accept and agree that they are the descendants of the Philistines, or are they saying
That's
that?
that's their claim
Yeah.
to validating that they are the true indigenous people. The reason why they call themselves Palestinians is because they're descendants of the indigenous people of of the Philistines.
Yeah.
Now,
So
what happened is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
so they
By the way,
would,
who is this? I don't recognize the
I'm
voice.
sorry, I'm David Tarr. Sorry.
Hi, David.
Hi. They wouldn't say that they're descendants of, say, the Canaanites. They claim to be the descendants of the Philistines.
Right, because the Canaanites were conquered. It was a known fact that they disappeared around 950 BCE, and that there is no, we're going to get to them too. There is very little indigenous, so to speak, proof of that they were ever there, other than things that like in our Torah, we make reference to the Canaanites. There's a Ugaritic stele. A stele is a um, governments would write on these large stones, and they were called steles, history, etc., and they would be on display in prominent places, Stele. And that's how we know about the Canaanites, the Torah, and various steles and similarity. But you wouldn't want to brag that you were descendants of a weak-link, non-powerful, loser. They never won the battles. They were conquered by us, by the Israelites, and then later, whatever was left, they were conquered by the
Okay, so then what you're showing
Zionites.
us is that, okay, the Palestinians claim they're descendants of the Philistines, and then you're showing us that the Philistines were from another area.
Completely, and that's what this DNA study shows.
Mhm.
So this undermines their authority, saying that they were indigenous. They weren't indigenous. That's why they chose and championed the term Palestine. DNA comparisons of the ancient Philistine genetic material with modern Palestinians shows an incompatible gene ratio rating of over 90%. That means on the other hand, Jews and Palestinians share a compatible gene rating of over 90. We are so related to Palestinians. We got to deal with it. It's 95. We share 95% the same DNA. Jews and most Palestinians are more related to each other than Palestinians are to the ancient Phoenician Palestinians they claim validates their entitlement to the disputed territories. Yeah, we have to acknowledge that there's been a lot of intermarrying or a lot of conversion out of Judaism. And that's another known fact. We know that there's a tremendous number of Jews who converted to Islam over the last 200 years, let alone in previous centuries. So these base pairings of the Phoenicians do not look anything like the ancient Palestinians.
Hey, Rabbi, it's Melanie. May I make a comment, or maybe it's a question? I'm not. Is it okay? I don't want to interrupt
Please
you.
go ahead. No, we encourage questions.
I think what I'm concerned with, I've seen everybody knows this. We know this as Jews. We all know this stuff. But maybe for me, especially in my work, like the crux of what do you do when people don't want to listen to what you can show them historically is true? Like, how do we? Like, no one is against us is going to sit and listen to this and want us to explain historically about the Levant. How do we get this far if nobody will even listen to us, talk to them?
That in itself can be an entire process. So,
I
for
know.
example, first thing you got to do is you got to become aware. You have to get the facts because eventually people are going to be swayed by facts, especially unless you're an Arab. If you're an Arab, don't argue with Arabs. You'll never win that. You know, there. Well, the idea is that who should we be arguing with? And the answer is teenagers, college kids, people, Westerners who have been misled by the Palestinian lies. And I think that if we work one-on-one or in small groups, we can re-educate them and show them using you cannot refute logic. Logic is a no-brainer. And a lot of this is just science, archaeology, history, and we're going to get to more history. So here's a very interesting thing that, again, in areas of Ashkelon and actually in Ashdod also, in classical Roman culture, dogs were consumed at feasts celebrating the inauguration of new priests. Pigs and wild boar were also a staple of the European diet. Remains of dogs and pigs bred and raised for consumption have been found throughout archaeological digs along the Mediterranean coastal plain of Israel. Now, this hurts me to have to teach it to you. That means that were they Jews eating dogs and pigs? Because no. And we know because the Philistines were a thorn on our side, that under King David, even, they were there and they were powerful and they weren't routed out. All this proves is that the Palestinians, are they willing to say that they dog and pig? That's ridiculous. Of course they're going to deny it. Then how do you explain, courtyards where scores of pig remains were found? Because they were breeding them for consumption. And this is important when we get to a couple later slides as well. In a rendering from the Getty Museum, an academic study tool for cuisine preparation and dining traditions of ancient Rome. So, by the way, this is our tradition on Pesach. What are you supposed to do when you eat on Passover? You're supposed to lean to your right, correct? I'm sorry, lean to your left. You're supposed to lean to your left because this is the way ancient Rome's, and it's discussed in the Torah. I'm sorry, in the Talmud. But what do you see over here? A pig. So that explains that there was whoever these Phoenicians, these ancient Palestinians were, that they were culturally more European than they were indigenous people. Now, this is one of the most powerful arguments. And in fact, if you were in Shul on Yom Kippur, when I talked about Israel, I actually use this in my sermon. If you've ever seen a high church, that means Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Coptic, even Episcopal churches, their crucifix has these letters on the top, INRI. It's not a word, it's an acronym. In the Christian Bible, John 19:12, Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor of Judea, he sentenced Jesus to crucifixion. Above the cross, a titulus, a plaque with the convict's charges, he had inscribed in Latin and Greek and Hebrew, and it said, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Iudeorum, which means Jesus of Nazareth, kings of the Judeans. Which means Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, not King of the Palestinians. That means 2,000 years ago, maybe you've heard it because there's the current president of the Palestinian Authority actually made a comment that Jesus was a Palestinian. He wasn't a Palestinian because it doesn't say, in your Jesus Nazarene Rexes Palestini. It doesn't say Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Palestinians, kings of the Jews. So the whole point, not only Christian Bible validates that we and only we were the indigenous people of Israel, even Roman history, because this is repeated in Roman history, that Pontius Pilate considered him the king of the Jews. And that's why he was worthy of getting the death penalty, because he thought he was leading an insurrection.
Rabbi, and maybe you'll address it a little bit later, but if you acknowledge that there's a 95% agreement between DNA of Jews and Palestinians, isn't the argument then that the Palestinians are, by virtue of their Jewish lineage, also indigenous people?
It's not merely valid. It's not just a merely valid argument. It's the only acceptable, token of permitting them to stay. That, I have a family member who obviously lives in Israel, and she is obnoxiously far to the right. But the only thing that she will agree that, some Palestinians would be allowed to live because they're descendants of Jews. We have to acknowledge it. By the way, maybe you remember me talking about this a number of years ago. Haaretz did a whole article about a gentleman. I think he worked for the Water Authority, and he was from like 1950 until like 19 to like 1975 or whatever, he was very close with a number of the Bedouin and the Arabs that were living in the Negev, and he became very close with them. And he announced his retirement. He worked well into his 80s. He just never retired. And when he announced his retirement, one of the sheikhs of the local village called him in and and sat him down, and they drank tea, and it was like a parting, going away party. His he would never see him again. And he said, "There's something I want to show you." This is all written up in the article in Haaretz. And the sheik of the community, of the Bedouin community, took out a box, opened up the box, and it was a pair of tefillin in an old blue bag, and a talid, and I think there was some other object that belonged to his grandfather. He said, I don't tell anyone, but I'm telling you, I'm descendants of the Jews. And it was his grandfather's. So there are many, many stories like that. The same thing that we know happens in Poland. If you've ever met Rabbi Michael Shudrich, here it is, 75 years after the Holocaust, and every month somebody comes to him and says, "I'm 55 years old and I just found out my mother and my grandmother were Jewish. What do I do?" It's similar. The only thing is that in the Arab communities, people know they're a descendant of Jews, but they're practicing Islam, and they're afraid to, make waves. Also, they've accepted their cultural identities, their new cultural identities. So this is also what I wanted. Yes?
Zahuva. When we look at the history of the Philistines in the Gaza area, which we call it today Gaza area, we're talking about around 600 years, between the 1200 before Christ to 600. But then when we read in the Bible, we read about Abraham, and it says there that they lived there were Philistines are mentioned there. Also Isaac, Avimelech, right? He goes to Gerar, the king of Philistines, it's mentioned. Are we talking about the same people?
Yeah, descendants of the Phoenicians. They were different. By the way, it says that Avimelech wasn't a name, it was a title.
Yeah, right.
And in fact, Pharaoh means that, right, it's not a name, it's a title. Mm-hmm. So the idea was that they had their own culture, their own language, their own, personality, community personalities.
So that's much before 1200. The 1200, they say that they came from Greece,
So what the question is, when did they come from the Aegean Basin? That would be closer to, listen, as a traditional Jew, I'm going to tell you the science of it, at least 3000 BCE. That's probably when they started.
The ones that settled in Gaza were later.
Right. Yeah. So this here, I wanted to show you something that's also very important when you discuss the validity of Palestinians claiming that they're indigenous. So they might, let's say for argument's sake, and it's just for argument's sake because I don't think it's accurate, that they are genetically and descendants of indigenous people. At what point do you no longer indigenous? So I'm going to stop the share for just a second. Let me ask you a question. At what point am I no longer a Polish Jew? My father's born in Poland. My mother is second generation American. I'm third generation American on my mother's side. Okay, I'm proud that my father's from Bialystok, but are my children Polish Jews? At what point are they no longer Polish Jews? Especially since, in all honesty, I think my family lived in Poland only 150 years. Let me ask you another question. Let's say, for example, you're born in Poland, you move to Havana, you live in Havana, and your children are born in Havana, and you live in from 1930 until you live in Cuba 30 years. 1960, you come to America. Are you really a Cuban? You might be a Cuban Jew, but are you really a Cuban? You weren't even born in Cuba. What about your children? Are they really Cubans? They're really Jews who lived in Poland for like a year? Or what happens if your parents are born in Cuba, they came to America and you're born in America? Are you really a Cuban Jew? Why? Because you speak Spanish? Because you like arroz con pollo? What? So the answer is, at what point do they stop being genetically, even if they are genetically, at what point do you stop becoming a Palestinian, a descendant of the Philistines? Now let's get back.
Rabbi,
Yes.
how about at what point are they no longer refugees?
That's the
Oh,
political question.
that's the political question. Do you know that? All right, we'll talk about that at the end. So
But
this is,
Rabbi,
yeah.
I just don't see how they can establish the connection between what the ancient Philistines and Palestinians. The fact that they used a term that the Romans coined and they occupy that land now doesn't in any way establish that there is an ethnic, genetic, or other connection between them.
So there were so many different ways to argue this point, and I just, as it is, we're about halfway through, but I do want to finish tonight. So let me ask you a question, and I've used this argument, I think, in a class about 5-6 weeks ago. In case you aren't aware, Arafat is an Egyptian name. What do you mean? Remember Yasser Arafat, the founder of the Palestinian Liberation Organization? His name was Arafat, and Arafat is an Egyptian name. If you go to Egypt, now, if someone said to you, what's your last name? And the answer is, oh, my last name is McDonald. Oh, you're Irish? Because, yeah, my grandparents are from Ireland. So if someone said to you, what's your last name? And the last name is Arafat, because where are you from? Palestine. He goes, no, you're not. You're McDonald. You're from Ireland. Your name is Arafat. You're from England. You're from Egypt. It's an Egyptian name. But would they sweep that under the counter too? Under the carpet, I mean. So let's get back to the text because it's all very relative. Share screen. So this is a really important, so now the question is, you might be genetically descendant from Polish Jews. At what time do you stop being Polish? So let's talk historic, cultural, and societal traditions of the ancient indigenous people of the conflict area 2,000 years ago and today. This isn't just about Philistines, okay? This is about, now let's talk about ancient Israel. What did we speak? Ancient Israelites, ancient Jews. We spoke Hebrew. Our holy book was the Torah. Our primary prophet was Moses. Our religion was Judaism. We prayed 3 times a day. Our holy city was Jerusalem. Okay, now skip over to the modern Israelis. Modern Israelis, what language do they use? Hebrew. What's their holy book? Torah. Who's their primary prophet? Moses. What's their religion? Judaism. How many times a day do they pray? 3 times. Their holy city? Still Jerusalem. Now, although I wrote ancient Philistines, let's broaden that to the ancient indigenous non-Israelite people of the Levant. What languages did they speak? Hittite and Aramaic. What do modern Palestinians speak? Arabic. What holy book did ancient Philistines have? And the answer is none. Modern Palestinians, they have a holy book called the Quran. Primary prophet in ancient times, there were none. Philistines, ancient Canaanites did not have, any known prophets. It wasn't part of their culture. Modern Palestinians, Muhammad. The religion, there was a pagan religion called Dagon. That was the primary religion of the coastal plain. Modern day Palestinian, Islam. Prayer, seasonal and sacrificial. Modern Palestinians, 5 times a day. Holy city was Gat and Ekron. Today, Mecca, Medina for modern Palestinians. So you see that culturally, historically, and societally, the modern Palestinians aren't even culturally or historically related. They have nothing that connects them to the indigenous people of 2,000 years ago. We are the same religion. We have the same, I'm not going to say we have the same cuisine, but, we eat Pesach, we eat matzah, we eat maror. I mean, we have the same culture of 2,000 years ago. It's been modernized, obviously, but how about the same garments? Talit, tzitzit. I mean, we wear things today that we wore 2,000 years ago. We eat things today that we ate 2,000 years ago. Our language, our holy books, our prophets, our prayer system, things that we go through on a daily basis, is a continuation and non-broken chain of the indigenous people from 2,000 years ago. Those people who call themselves indigenous, descendants of indigenous, they might be genetic. Let's, for argument's sake, say that they are descendants of indigenous people, but they're not culturally heritage. They're not indigenous. It's like me, it's like my grandchildren calling themselves Polish Jews, because when my grandchildren grow up and have children, my great-grandchildren will have lived in America much longer than my family lived in Poland. So would they still call themselves Polish Jews? The answer is absolutely not. They could have proud that for about 120. Actually, we know that my family actually came from, believe it or not, northern Ukraine, via Mir, et cetera, into Eastern Poland. But we were a maximum in Poland, maybe 125 years. Okay, my parents, my father came, in 1930. My mother's family came in 1890. So the whole point is that on my mother's side, my family's lived longer in America than my family lived in Poland. Now, that being said, these people do not have a cultural identity that's consistent with the indigenous people. We have a culture, we have a society, we have historical heritage that is consistent, unbroken, we are the indigenous people. We act, speak, and practice just like the indigenous people did 2,000 years ago. We are the indigenous people, not them. Let's take a break. And yes, Ahuva.
I believe also they were exiled with us by Nebuchadnezzar, weren't they? Into Babylonia. That's, I think, that's the story. And I believe that from there on, they never came back like we did into.
So what's really interesting is DNA studies of the Samaritans, the Shomranim, find that there really is a lot going on there, that we share even more DNA with Samaritans.
Right.
However, the Samaritans have a very interesting haplotype as well, and that is Hindu-Persian, Indian and Persian. And that is consistent with the teaching that Sancheiriv in 722 BCE, when he took the 10 tribes out, he exiled and they got lost.
Right.
He brought a non-indigenous group that were his slaves, because they needed, you don't want the land to go fallow. So he brought in about 25,000 people to settle the land of northern Israel, when he removed about 150,000 of the 10 tribes. And that would be consistent with, here it is, 2,400 years later or more, that there is a Hindi geno effect from, by the way, as you know, Hungarian is related to Hindi. And the swastika is actually an ancient Hindu symbol. So when you talk about the science and genetics of the indigenous people, I think my goal tonight was to show you that scientifically, archaeologically, that the people that they claim to be descended of, that validates their claim, is definitely, they got to think of a new plausible theme, because that one's not accurate. To say that they're descendants of the Philistines and that's why they're called Palestinians, bad argument. Archaeologically proves them incorrect. Oh, by the way, talking about cuisine, are they willing to say if their descendants, they don't practice the same religion and they don't eat pork, they don't eat pig, So again, I think that tonight's class is really to give us some viable arguments against you. Please don't argue with Arabs. You're not going to win. It's just going to get very loud, and you're gonna and they're going to scream over you. However, especially one-to-one, and especially with people that are willing to debate and talk and be logical, logic and facts always wins, unless you're dealing with someone who is a religious fanatic. So let me explain to you what about religious fanaticism is. That many of you remember Rachel Abramowitz of blessed memory. She was Rabbi Abramowitz's wife. And I was director of education before I became the rabbi at Menorah. I was the rabbi in Asheville. And before that, in 1984 and 80 to 86, I was director of education at Temple Menorah. And she once gave a lecture to, then it was called the Sisterhood, and it was very well attended. And she gave a lecture in which she discussed in 1984, she said, the Palestinians are not the true concern of the future. Islamic fundamentalism is. And everyone goes, what? What are you talking about? Well, you know, it's the Palestinians. Because no, there was a group developing, you know, the Islamic Brotherhood had been around since the 1950s, but they were beginning to grow in the 1980s. And she basically said, what an Arab won't do for political reasons, they'll do for religious reasons, which means, you know, yes, you know, Nasser told me to storm the Israeli border. Nasser, General Nasser, screw him. I'm not going to kill myself for him. However, Allah tells you you have to do it, and if you do it, you'll go right to heaven and you'll get 70. Allah told me I have to do it. Point me in the right direction. People will do for God what they wouldn't do for man. So that's why when you argue with Arabs, you got to be careful, because there's a religious fundamentalism attached to their political aspirations. And that's not an argument that I recommend that you try to get into. You're wasting your breath. However, it's never too late to change the tide of what's going on in America. So let me remind you that colleges change their student body every 4 to 6 years. That means if we work hard now and get out like President Gay and McGill and everyone else, then in 4 to 6 years, you can see a significant change on campuses.
But Rabbi, they're still going to be
teaching. And then after the 4 to 6 years, when we start creating a generation of more educated, more properly informed kids, then when they get out, you know, in the streets, then they'll act in more appropriately as well. That's my opinion.
Rabbi, but if they're still teaching in the schools, so how is that removing them?
So what's happening now is you're seeing that there's a wake up. You know, I hate to say it, but like every cloud has a silver lining. And one of the things that we're seeing now is that in the last 3 months, many articles have been written in the rabbinic world, how all of a sudden people are joining synagogues, how attendance in synagogue is actually up. And definitely the amount of money raised for Israel has broken all records. By the way, in case you aren't aware, Aliyah is up 20% in just 3 months. 20%. In fact, in the month of December just ended, 850 French Jews made Aliyah in 1 month. Unheard of. So my point to you is that that we can see that there's a way to change things for the future. I really do. So here's the whole point about wake up. So you've got I don't want to get specifics, but you have millionaires who give hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars who have withdrawn their support. And unfortunately, the way the real world works is money talks, and you know what walks. And all of a sudden, these Jews had this rude awakening that they've been, you know, dishing their money out to Miami Ballet and the Miami's, you know, Center for the Arts. And all of a sudden, they said, you know what, without Israel, my grandchildren will be up the creek. And all of a sudden, in addition to that, they come to the realization that they've been giving hundreds of millions of dollars to universities that have become centers of phenomenal misinformation and damage to the world. And it's not just Mideast politics. You know, these universities are the center of such narishkeit.
But Rabbi, it's not just the universities. It starts in elementary school now and goes on in terms of, if you look at the curriculum that they're just doing in California, horrifying. Massachusetts, you know, you think of as a lot of Jews there. In Maryland, it's not just the universities, and we have to be aware that that kind of brainwashing is starting very young. So after 10 years of that, I don't know that 4 years of university, maybe it will certainly help, it won't hurt, but it's probably not enough.
So there's a lot of what's the correct term? What's the saying? There's a lot of light at the end of the tunnel. So, for example, evangelical churches are, thank God, growing. And as I'm sure everyone knows, evangelical churches are about as, some of them are so pro-Israel, so Zionistic, they embarrass many other Jewish communities. The first month of October, the first 4 weeks of the war, oh shoot, I forgot the name of the Christian group. They actually sorry.
Kufi.
Right, Christians United for Israel. They transferred something like $60 million in 1 month from their pension plan and bought Israeli bonds. Melanie's on. Melanie probably give us more information about that. Okay, she was in her car. So the idea is that that's absolutely amazing that evangelical Christians are so pro-Israel and they're growing. Second thing is, light at the end of the tunnel, is that evangelical Christians are having 4 to 6 children, and the other people are not. And I think that we can slowly turn the tide with education and fertility and evangelical Christians. I think that we just have to be careful because there are some issues that I don't agree with evangelical Christians. And number one thing I don't agree with them, and it's actually a halachic issue, is that they don't believe that there should be any abortions whatsoever, ever. I think like 6 weeks is just so unrealistic, and halachically it causes a problem. So there are some other minor. That's the major one, uh, abortion rights. But that being said, I see a lot of light at the end of the tunnel, but only if we keep on working very, very diligently. And I think it has to be a multi-pronged attack because it is a war. It's a war against anti-Israelism. And it's got to be multi-level. The good news is that children are so impressionable, and a lot of times the indoctrination that they get at a very young age can easily be reoriented. And that's a good thing. But I think it's going to be a long process. I don't think that. Oh, here's an interesting thing. Guatemala is moving their embassy to Jerusalem, and Central American countries have a growing evangelical presence. The Roman Catholic Church is dwindling. Evangelical Christians are growing. I'm not going to say algebraically, but definitely geometrically, and they're turning more and more and more pro-Israel. And the proof is, by the way, everyone know what happened in Argentina? Who the new president of Argentina is? This guy
Yeah.
is like
Yes,
he's
Yeah,
like
yeah. He's very
it's very,
pro-Israel.
yeah.
he
Yes.
honestly, I'm worried. Do you know after he won the election, he disappeared for 3 days? Do you know where he went? To the
I think he went
Lubavitcher Rebbe's. He went to the Lubavitcher Rebbe's grave with his rabbi to
Mhm.
thank the
Yeah.
Rebbe. To thank. I mean, this guy is like, whoa. So there's light at the end of the tunnel. There really is. But you should never allow anyone to voice anti-Zionism without learning some of these facts and confronting them. You got to confront them with facts and with knowledge and be steadfast. Because when a person's, you chip away at it, listen back and forth, and you'll see that eventually they have to give in. It's just, for example, if they're Christian, it's like, what's on top of the cross? Jesus of Nazareth, king of the whom? Palestinians? There were no Palestinians. So if you're a Christian, how could you say that the Palestinians were indigenous? It doesn't say king of the Palestinians, it says king of the Jews. Even in the Christian Bible, they acknowledge that Jesus was a Jew, not a Palestinian. So, well, Chevra, I hope you enjoyed the class. I went a little bit faster than usual because there were 35 slides, but we did them all. So I hope you enjoyed class. God willing, we'll see you tomorrow morning in Shul, 8 a.m. Ahuva's there every morning at 8 a.m. on Zoom. She runs the Zoom minion. She's there every morning. A couple quick notes. Ahuva, again, arranges so many things for us. She's arranged for us to get 100 hostage dog tags. And I came back with one, and I use it in the display at Shul, but I want to start wearing it. And we're going to use it as a fundraiser so that we can raise, I want to start sending a monthly stipend to various groups in Israel that are helping the survivors of the August 7th and the hostages that were released. The trauma is unbelievable, unbelievable. So we're going to be doing it as a fundraiser to raise money for the hostages. And
Robert?
if you don't want to tag, you just want to give some money, we're going to be collecting and reorienting the money to needy sources. Yes, somebody called me.
One of the things that is important to also explain is not just what it was when the Romans were there, but all the things, all the history that happened in between, that time and 1947, because it wasn't called Palestine throughout all of that time. There is no uninterrupted history of the current people who call themselves Palestinians and who used to be Arabs, and different waves of Islamic conquerors. There were the Umayyads, the this, the that, a number of different groups coming from different areas of the world. You had a lot of
what's the funniest part is?
Nomadic tribes.
By the 4th century, no one called it Palestine.
Philistine. That's what that's exactly it.
The Arabs called it Judea.
Yes.
The Arabs called it Judea.
That's why you have to not just jump from one period in history to the modern now. You have to go through those stages so that people really understand that there is no such connection. I mean, They have been successful in calling themselves descendants of Abraham, when there is absolutely no scientific proof, not genetic, nor otherwise, of that. It's simply that Muhammad, in the 7th century, decided that his tribe was an Ishmaelite tribe, and that his people descended from him. Other than his statement to that effect, none of those tribes that lived in those areas made any such connection, historically, politically, or otherwise. But we don't say anything, and we just take it for granted and never demand any proof. And it's really something that from repetition and repetition becomes a truth when it has never been established.
Right. That's a very good point. And personally, all I can add is, remember that unfortunately I closed the presentation, but remember I showed you that map of Islamic colonialism?
Yes.
I mean, how could they argue we're the colonialists? I mean, it's like bizarre.
But Rabbi, another issue is that a tenet of Islam is that once a land is conquered by Islam, it must always remain in Islam. So if your tenet of religion believes that, then, as you said, there is no rational argument. It's what mine is mine, and what you took back is still mine, and therefore I can kill you to get it back, and you're the ones, because God ordained me to kill you. As you said, you can't argue with that. It's just basic to the religion.
You should know that there are a number of countries in Europe that are having a rude awakening lately. And in fact, did you know that Poland refused to accept Syrian refugees?
Right.
There's not one There's not one Syrian refugee in all Poland. There are Arabs,
Yeah.
but they don't have a refugee presence.
Neither the
And
Hungarian nor the Czechoslovakian, for that matter.
And what happens is the Minister of Foreign Affairs was interviewed, and he goes, no, we don't want them, and we're not taking them. There's a famous interview. You can see it on YouTube. He goes, why not? Because we don't want them, because they're not like us. And like he was right up front. He goes, no, and you can't make us. But you're a member of NATO. So what? Try and force us. We won't. We didn't. And by the way, they don't have Arab protests in Warsaw. They don't have stopping, traffic and
Exactly.
breaking into stores. Who would ever think that Jews in Poland were safer than Jews in London or in Chicago or in New York? But there's this rude awakening happening in Europe, and I unfortunately, I don't want to give misinformation, but I think it was one of the Scandinavian countries. I think it wasn't Norway, so I'm going to say
Denmark, I think, Rob. Are you talking
or
about
Sweden.
Denmark?
They're talking about any landed immigrant who commits a felony will be deported.
Oh.
And there's
The
discussion
19th.
even in France. I'm not sure it's going to, because they have a very liberal community as well. But there's, the far right was discussing it, and it was gaining. Again, every cloud is a silver lining. As Europeans are having this rude awakening. If you remember that Shabbat, I showed pictures of Arab demonstrations against Israel, Arab demonstrations pro-Hamas in New York, Chicago, LA, Montreal, Toronto, and Paris, and London. Remember I showed you those pictures? And all you saw were Palestinian flags in these countries. Then I showed you pictures of Israeli pro-Israel rallies, where every rally, no matter where it was, if it was in Paris, a French and an Israeli flag. If it was in America, an American, and all you saw were American and Israeli flags. In Montreal and Toronto, Canadian and Israel. It was a statement that we love the countries we live in. And the Palestinians were also making a statement. And that's a rude awakening, especially understand in Montreal, where it's not a is it a derogatory term? Is it not a derogatory term? I don't know. Canucks, I don't know. Whatever. They're very nationalistic in Montreal, and there's a growing antagonism. And in Toronto, there's a huge Islamic Pakistani community. And at first, they were having, one of my closest friends, Chezi Zionist, was from Toronto. So the first generation were classical Muslim Pakistanians, and they had mosques and regular buildings. They did not build fancy domes. Their second generation, they had a lot of problems with their second generation. They were going off to McDonald's and they were eating cheeseburgers and pork and drinking, getting drunk. It was the second, like their kids were assimilating. And now in the third generation, they had problems with kids being radicalized in Toronto. Kids are being radicalized. And they were the ones that were showing up to these anti-Israel rallies. But the whole point is that now there's a movement as well in Ottawa that to revoke student visas and to extradite people that are arrested for felonies, who do not have citizenship. Send them back. And it's a growing phenomenon in many countries because they've seen what they're going to be up against. Yeah. Yes.
I think UNRWA also perpetuates the narrative.
But we're finding out UNRWA is Hamas. UNRWA is Hamas. Yeah.
There's some very, very famous pictures. I'm not sure if you saw them. The tunnels, they filled UNRWA bags with, wheat bags up with cement, and they were using them to fortify. Also, they found UNRWA bags in an UNRWA location full of weapons. But in addition to all of this, talking about perpetuation of a fake refugee status, since the establishment of the United Nations, there have been 8 different refugee organizations established. The longest one was for refugees from Nepal and Tibet, and that was like 28 years long. And then it was dissolved because the refugees were absorbed into alternative communities. The oldest and longest refugee organization is UNRWA, and it's basically 75 years old.
And the most amount of money by 10, 20, 30 times what everyone else got.
Hundreds of billions of dollars have gone to them.
Rabbi.
And if you have the opportunity, go to YouTube and search the Israel Boys. And what they are, it's a group of 5 or 6 Christians who went to Israel, and all they do is travel Israel debunking Palestinian myths. And one of my favorite ones, this is how I found them, and now I get their emails almost daily. Very high level production. They really do. They also have a talk show, a radio show, and they're up, by the way, they're Christians. They're up to like 100,000 subscribers. It's slowly growing. We should help it grow. So what happens is they have a pickup truck. They're in Israel, and they get on a camera and they go, "We're about to go. We've never been there. We want to go see this refugee camp. It's in the West Bank." And they take out their GPS and they enter the GPS coordinates, and they go, "Yep." They get out of their truck. "We're just taking a break before we pull into this refugee camp because, there may not be bathrooms." So they took a bathroom stop on the side of the road. Then they get into the truck, the pickup truck, and they're filming it. And they come over the hill, and there's this, it looks like Sunny Isles, 15, 20-story condominiums, and they start driving through the town. I think it was Rafia. And you Google them, you'll see it on YouTube and you'll follow it. And they don't see anyone. It's like a ghost town. They finally see a guy and they pull over and they introduce themselves. "We're Christians, da, da, da." And the guy goes, "Oh, well, welcome, welcome, welcome." And he goes, "Well, where is everybody?" He goes, "Oh, well, they live abroad. They live in the United States, in Detroit. They live in Venezuela. They live in Curacao. They live in Paris. But they come in the summer. They bring their children so their children can learn the heritage and culture of Palestine." He goes, "And this is amazing." He goes, yeah, it was all built by the European Union. So he goes, "Well, who runs the place?" He goes, "Well, in the summer, the population goes up to like 10,000. And in the rest of the year, it's like 1,500 people. We stay, we maintain things. So, oh, what, you need to go to the city hall." So they go to the city hall and they meet with the mayor. And he goes, can we tape? He goes, "Of course, please, Christians. Yeah, of course." And they interview him, and he said, and they go, "And where exactly is everyone?" "Well, they live abroad, but they come during the summer." And then all of a sudden, it dawns on him what he's been saying. And he goes, "And it's because of the Israelis, because they're afraid to live here." And like, so then they thanked him. There's the photo op, they shake hands, and then they drive away. They pull the pickup truck over and they get out. And he goes, "I think you guys all figured it out," right? Because as soon as it dawned on him that he was, proving everything that the Israelis said, he had to badmouth the Israelis because, everyone lives here. This is like their second home. They have a summer home in Rafia, whatever the name of the community was.
Rabbi.
There is a light at the end of that tunnel. Yes.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Rabbi.
Yes.
In the late 1930s, I don't remember, it was 1938 when the nations like Jordan and all these places were created. Jordan was supposed to be the place for these Arabs to live, these now so-called Palestinians. So
what happened was prior to 1948, Jordan was part of the the Ottoman Empire, and what happened was the Hashemite family of Saudi Arabia helped Britain, and they were instrumental in the war. So in 1908, so what happened was they were granted under the British mandate, they were rewarded, and the legal term is the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And the Hashemites was a tribe of northern Saudi Arabia, and they were rewarded with their own country. And that's how they got Jordan. That's why the second king of Jordan, or the third, I think it's the third king of Jordan. But the whole idea was that it was a British, there never was a Jordan.
Exactly, and the Arabs living in before it was called Israel and Palestine were going to be part of that place, but
That's a famous discussion. It's I'm not sure how to even broach it, but yes. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed class, and I really appreciate that everyone stayed. So many of us stayed an extra half hour. Have a good evening, everyone.
Good
Tomorrow
night.
morning, Minions at 8, and then we have a Torah class at noon. And God willing, we'll see you on Shabbat. Good night.
Rabbi, we'll be missing your class tomorrow. Okay, I'm sorry.